I'm going to demonstrate how to create hardcovers for a stab-bound book. I have pieces of cut acid-free Davy board, and the first thing I'm doing is just sanding the edges slightly to knock down some of that sharpness. I'm using a rough nail file, but you could use a piece of sandpaper. Next, I'm going to apply glue to the surface of my board. I'm using a straight PVA glue because this book is pretty small. If I needed to extend the time that my glue is going to be wet, I could create a mix of half PVA and half methyl cellulose, or half PVA and a quarter wheat paste and a quarter methyl cellulose. That would enable me to have the glue dry a little slower. So as I'm applying the glue, I'm starting from the center of the board and I'm working my way out over the edge of the board on all sides. I'm using a dedicated gluing brush, but you could use any stiff bristled brush to apply glue to your board. So I'm carefully working the surface and trying to make sure that I don't have any holes in the glue. I'm always going to glue on top of a waste sheet of newsprint to keep my surface working space clean. So now I'm going to position my glue on top of my piece of paper. It's hard to tell from the video, but I actually have little guide marks drawn in pencil so that I'm positioning my board in the center of this paper, which is about 3/4 of an inch larger than the board on all four sides. The next thing I need to do is just burnish the paper down to the board. I'm going to flip it over and use a bone folder. If you're worried about the surface of your paper, you can protect it with a piece of wax paper before you start rubbing the paper down. You could also use your hand to do this, but the bone folder just kind of glides across the surface of the paper a little bit better. So now I'm going to remove the excess paper from the corners. When I cut the corners off, I'm going to be really careful to make sure that I don't cut them right to the edge of the board. I want to cut the corners about a board thickness away from the edge of the board so that when I fold my corners up, I don't have any holes at the corner of the board, and it's a little bit hard to see that. Sometimes what I'll do is I'll just press the paper up to the side of the board and I'll try and get a little indentation where it meets the top edge of the board. So you can see from my cuts there's just a slight overhang, and I'm cutting at about a 45-degree angle. When I'm making my cuts, I'm cutting away from the board and I'm making sure to use a really sharp X-Acto blade. So I'm going to remove all four corners before I start gluing up those edges, because once I start folding the edges over, I want to work fast because I want to get this whole board done and underweight before anything starts to dry. So I am going to glue the top edges first. I'm going to use a flat paintbrush to do this. I like to use a flat paintbrush to glue these smaller pieces, and it's just a cheap number 12 paintbrush. So just like I did when I applied the glue to the board, I'm going to take the glue and apply from the board, working my way out. I'm also making sure that I work the glue all the way into the outside edge of the board. I want to make sure there are no gaps or air holes when I go to fold this edge over. So I'm going to carefully pick my board up. I'm going to remove that sheet of newsprint, and I'm just going to work that edge up over and onto my board, pulling a little bit as I do it. I'm going to use my bone folder to help work it over the edge of the board. And again, I'm trying to make sure that I avoid any air bubbles by pulling tightly over the edge. I'm going to press it all down. When I'm working with glue, I like to have a couple of rags in my workspace, one that's slightly damp and one that's dry, so that I can wipe any glue off my hand and keep everything clean as I go. I'm also going to use wax paper to protect the surface, just in case I squeeze any glue out as I work that paper into the board. When I get to the corners, again, I'm going to look for any excess glue. I'm just going to press those corners down. I want a nice clean edge when I fold that up. And I'm just going to continue to use the same technique to cover the rest of the three sides. So gluing from the edge of the board off of the paper, pressing it up, burnishing it down, working it onto the board with my bone folder, and carefully making sure that my corners are pressed in. Now that I've finished covering the outside of my board, I want to finish it off by covering the inside. I have a sheet of decorative paper that is cut about 1/4 of an inch smaller on each side than the size of my board. I'm just placing it down here to get a visual for where I want to position it. Once I glue it, I'm not going to have a lot of time, and I'm really going to have to get it down quickly. So when I glue this paper, I'm going to use the exact same technique I used to apply glue to my board. I'm going to start in the center, and I'm going to work my way out. And I'm really carefully trying to get that glue into the fibers of the paper. I'm using firm pressure, but I'm trying to be gentle. What I want to avoid doing is shifting that paper on top of the newsprint. If I do that, I could get a little bit of glue under the edge, and then my paper could stick to the newsprint and rip. So I'm going to be really careful when I apply this glue. You don't have to rush when you're applying glue. Just take it slow and just let the paper kind of relax. Depending on what kind of paper you're using, you might get a little bit of curling, and that'll calm down if you just slowly work the glue into the paper. So I'm just about done covering this sheet with glue. It gets a little tricky because there's glue everywhere and on my fingers, so I find the easiest way to get this paper up is to wipe my hands first, and then I'm going to use the little tip of an X-Acto blade. I'm just going to get that under there to get that paper cleanly off the newsprint. You can see it's just a little sticky on the edges. I'm pulling that up, and then I want to very quickly remove this sheet of newsprint because it's got glue all over it, put my board into position, and get this sheet of paper down. Again, I'm trying to remember exactly where it was positioned. Just keep in mind that depending on the paper, sometimes it can expand a little bit when it gets wet with the glue. This piece of paper, it didn't expand too much. So I'm trying to get that into position before I press it down. So I want to do a very light burnishing on the surface just to make sure that it's in place, and then I want to really work it in with my bone folder. I'm going to protect that paper with a sheet of wax paper, again, just in case I squeeze any excess glue out. I don't want to rip any of the paper. So I'm going to work that in. Try to make sure that there are no air bubbles. Again, initially I'm going to burnish from the center out. I always want to do that because that'll force out any bubbles that are in there. Then I want to wrap it up in wax paper to protect it. And this is very important. I want to get it under weight, and I want to keep it under weight until it dries. So I'm using a couple of bricks that have been covered in book cloth. You can use several heavy books if you want to, just as long as it's heavy enough to kind of hold it down. Now I'm going to create the front cover, which is going to have a hinge. So I've got 2 sheets of board with a little gap in the middle that's about 1/4 of an inch wide. So I am first applying the larger sheet of board. Now I'm going to glue the spine piece. In order to position this, I'm using a little brass spacer that I got at a hardware store, but you could just draw that on with a pencil. I just like the spacers because it makes it really easy. And I'm basically going to use the same process now that I did to do the back cover. I'm going to work that paper into the board. I'm going to carefully cut out the excess paper on my four corners, remembering to just leave a board width of space there at the corner. So I'm just going to work my way around, and then I'm going to glue each side. Again, I'm going to pay extra close attention to the corners. One thing when you're making a hinged cover, you also want to make sure that you work that paper into the hinged area, that little negative space, so that hinge is going to fold easily. Okay, so I'm going to fold up my last side. I'm going to get those corners nice and flat. A lot of times for this type of book, you might want to add an extra sheet of paper just for, you know, a little bit more strength and protection of where that book is going to be folded as you open it. So I've just cut a little spine piece. And so it's going to give a little extra support to that hinge, and it's going to also be a decorative element. So in that case, you can see that I cut my corners out before gluing, just because it's such a small piece, I want to glue the whole piece of paper at once. And this particular paper that I'm using is called Momogami, and it's really easy to work with because it's nice and stretchy, and that makes it great for hinges, and it's also really easy to create nice clean corners with it. You can see I worked that into the hinge. Now on the front, I'm going to get everything burnished down. Again, I'm going to work it into the hinge, making sure that that folds easily. So I'm just, doing a little bit of finishing. The last thing I have to do is apply paper for my inside front cover, using the same technique I used for the back cover, gluing from the center out, being extra careful. In some ways, this sheet of paper is probably the most difficult thing to glue and put into position because it's just not very forgiving. So just take your time. Again, I'm just going to kind of eyeball that. I can shift it around a little bit while the glue is wet. So, just put it down lightly, and if you see that it's uneven, you can lift it up usually slightly and shift it around. Again, I'm paying extra close attention to that hinge. I want to work that paper into it so that it folds nicely. You can see I'm just double checking that that is not too stiff in there. Now, Japanese paper is really great for making hinges because it does tend to stretch really nicely. Going to stack the front cover on top of the back cover with a piece of wax paper sandwiched between them. I'm going to put it under weight and I'm going to let it dry overnight. Ta-da!